I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
I was wondering if we could shift gears. I wanted to ask you about your video game journalism, because it seems like a completely different topic. And I'm just wondering, how did you get into video game journalism? And then maybe you could tell my listeners about your latest piece in The New Yorker.
Yeah, so I started out as a freelance journalism covering video games. That's really how I began, and writing for the specialist press, for magazines here in the UK, and then for the internet. And it was through covering the game. You know, I think having a beat, there's nothing wrong with having a beat, right? And learning, there are good, interesting stories, whether you're writing about film, about pop music, about foreign wars, or about video games, whatever it is, there's always good stories. There's always stories that illuminate the human condition or the systems of the world. And that's absolutely true in games. And for me, that's just where I started out. That happened to be the thing I was writing about and learning about. And actually, I got into writing these narrative non-fiction books set during the Second World War because I was working on a radio piece for The New Yorker about war games. And these are the games that governments and militaries play, you know, like board games really, to imagine potential outcomes of situations in the world. So, you know, for example, if there's a difficult international situation, let's say prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the American government was worried that Vladimir Putin might invade Ukraine. They would have run war games to imagine, right, let's imagine Russia invades Ukraine. What might happen there? So they play a game where different military officers would assume the roles of different countries, and they would play a game to sort of see what the potential outcomes were in order to understand what their reactions might be. And I was doing this interviewing a major here in the UK who is one of the designers of these games. And I said, have you got an example of where something learned in a game was useful in the real world? And he told me about a story in the Second World War, how a naval officer had designed a game to help Britain understand why the U-boats were sinking so many of its ships in the Battle of the Atlantic, and that turned into my first book, A Game of Birds and Wolves. So it's a bit of a transition, but I was interested in games and game design and how games can impact the real world, and that's what led me to that book. And then I wrote more books about the Second World War. So that's my sort of journey. But it's always just about my interest in the world, my interest in people, my interest in I suppose how games can impact the real world. And that's certainly the case with the piece that you mentioned there that I just published.
This is how a school shooting became a video game.
Yeah, so I heard in late last year, in about October, that the parents of Joaquin Oliver, who was murdered in the Parkland, Florida school shooting in 2018, had released a video game on Steam, or a computer game I should say, in which you play as a student during an active school shooting. It seems a very taboo subject to me, but also extremely interesting that the parents of a victim of one of these incidents would have put their name to this sort of project. So yeah, I just wanted to find out what led them to do that, whether the game is, when you're making a game like that that's really trying to draw public attention to the issues and maybe campaign for changes in particular gun laws in Florida or whatever it might be, when you've got a game like that, the goal isn't necessarily to make it as fun as possible or to keep people playing for as long as possible, which are the sort of things that game designers normally do. And if you're making Call of Duty, you're trying to get people to play Call of Duty every day. If you're making a game like this school shooting game, your aim isn't to get people playing it forever and spending money on costumes, on skins or whatever. Your aim is to start a conversation. So
it's neither like one of these games that's trying to get you to buy microtransactions, but it's also, I think when people hear school shooting game, they're thinking, if you're really into your video games, there was stuff like there's these shock games that were made, like Super
Right.
Columbine RPG, and it's not that either. It's actually trying to start an actual conversation rather than being just a way to get microtransactions done.
Definitely. Yeah.
Or
it's
like a shock piece. Yeah.
Yeah, it's neither of the. Well, yes. I mean, it's for free, so you don't pay any money for it. It only lasts 10 minutes, and that's because the makers of the game say that's the average length of time of a school shooting. So yeah, it's something that's meant to just be played over a 10-minute period, and then starts a conversation. Really, there is a certain amount of shock value because I wouldn't have wanted to write about it. We wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't in some way provocative or transgressive, right? So, they are definitely trying to shock, because you hear the idea, oh, the parents of a victim of a school shooting made a video game about school shootings. That's interesting, at least, Why would they do that? So, yeah, I think there is a certain element of shock behind it, but it's very, as far as it could be.
I think it's very different than the usual type of, yeah.
Yeah, there's no gore in it. It's, this might be the wrong way of putting it, but it's tastefully done in the sense that most of the violence is heard rather than seen, and things like that. So they've certainly tried to tread a careful line with what they've made. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask one more question on video game stuff. I promise to let you go, and I know we could probably devote a whole episode to this, but one thing I've always thought about video games, and I got out of video games like fairly young, probably after the sixth generation consoles, but it always sort of made me sad. I felt like there's always been this idea that video games weren't or aren't, works of art, or they can't be that. They're just these sort of passing diversions. And I think there's always these glimpses we see of people trying to push the medium to be more than just a passing diversion. There was an indie game I played a while back called Hotline Miami that I think did some really interesting things story-wise. Do you think that where is the state of gaming when it comes to developers that really want to push this medium into being more than just a diversion, that do want to treat it as an art form? Because I think it is an art form ultimately.
Yeah, I think there's certainly many very talented creative developers that are certainly trying to do that, and you've got that at the blockbuster end of things with companies like Naughty Dog, who are trying to make sort of cinematic style games like The Last of Us, that has then gone on to become a hit prestige TV show. But you've also got it at the independent end of the sector with games like Papers, Please, which are trying to tell a very interesting story in a way that only a video game could do. And for me, those are particularly interesting. And there's certainly been a lot of efforts to do that, and the question of whether games can be art or not is something that's been raging on for 30 years. I think the film critic Roger Ebert caused a big stir when he said games could never be art, and people got very upset, but it's an ongoing conversation. I mean, for me, the big risk to that at the moment, or the thing that's threatening video games legitimacy as a potential art form, is really the fact
Fortnite?
Well, there's nothing wrong with Fortnite or with Call of Duty Warzone or with any of those big games, but and I enjoy and play them. But I would say, there is companies are increasingly trying to make their games more like Instagram or TikTok, in the sense that they want them to be part of your daily routine, something that you go back to every day. It's where you meet your friends for a game. It's where you spend your money. You play that game forever. And the reason they want to do that is because it's very expensive to make games. And so, why not? If you can make a game that people come back to all the time, why not do that? But I think the social mediaification of video games is quite threatening towards the health of the ecosystem, because it kind of sucks up all the money and the investment, and it stops companies perhaps so much investing in games that just want to tell a 5-hour story with a really interesting game mechanic, or with a really in moving narrative with a start, a middle, and end. Those kind of games are really threatened, I think, in the current ecosystem. So I don't think they're ever going to go away, but yes, I'm concerned, I would say, about the current state of how games are made and funded.